On behalf of Randstad, I am delighted to invite you here this morning, to greet you here for our first Women Powering Business Forum here in the U.S.
If you have a passion for something, it's much easier to be successful.
Those businesses that have women on board far outperform on the bottom line.
Men and women bring different qualities to leadership, and that's why a blend is best. I'm pulling support from, and I'm not going to trade on it.
So I think women are often faced with choices that are really impossible choices, and that's not true.
Good morning, thank you for coming. I'm sure you are all reminded this morning why you don't live or work in Buckhead. Yeah. I think there was even an accident coming off the on-ramp here to get here. I hope it was not caused by any of you. Or on behalf of Randstad, I am delighted to invite you here this morning, to greet you here for our first Women Powering Business Forum here in the U.S. This idea kind of came to us, or came to me, this summer when I was visiting Canada, where, as you may or may not know, in Montreal, there's been a Formula One race for many years. So Formula One is quite a popular sport in Canada, and I had the pleasure of being there during the time that that was going on, and went to a luncheon, which really had the same topic as our breakfast, and met Susie, and had the opportunity to have this type of discussion with, a similar panel of very, very successful, very accomplished women, and it was absolutely fantastic. I think that I took away a lot from it. I think the audience took away a lot, and we really accomplished two things, and this is what I'm hoping that we can accomplish today. First of all, I think people, myself included, left with a lot of ideas about what we can do when we go back to our organizations to foster a culture that promotes women. I know that's foremost on the agendas of many companies and many organizations, but it's actually more complicated to execute than many of us thought or anticipated. And very often when we accomplish one thing and we think, there we go, now we're going to really start getting somewhere, we realize that in fact there's a new challenge that will thwart our results until we overcome it. So I'm hoping this morning you'll leave with that. And I'd say a secondary benefit to all of you joining us this morning is you will probably leave, as I did last time, with some great advice or some great thoughts on what you can do, as you're out there blazing the trail in your own careers, some thoughts, some strategies, some best practices that we can gain from listening to the women here this morning. So to kick things off, to get the party started, as they say, I'd like to introduce Susie Wolff. So I first met Susie in Toronto, and Susie is a test driver on our Formula One team. So I say our. We're probably a small sponsor. It's the royal we, of the Williams Formula One team. And Stacy, can talk to us a lot about what it's like to be a woman making her way in a field that's not exactly awash with females, as you probably know. And Stacy started her career in karting. Is that right, Stacy? So between 1996 and 1999, she was Britain's top woman karter, so the British Woman Karter of the Year for 4 years, and then was the top female karter in the world in the year 2000. So, yeah. Stacy is only one of 4 women this decade that have worked in Formula One, that have driven in Formula One. And here's an interesting fact. From 1950 to today, in the last 60 years, only 5 women have participated in the Grand Prix race. So, for those of us who think, gosh, women are really underrepresented in what we do, I think Susie will teach us a thing or two. Before I invite Stacy to the stage, and we're going to talk today a lot about overcoming obstacles. Susie faced an interesting obstacle yesterday as she came to the U.S. for the first time. They lost her luggage. So, despite her celebrity, Susie doesn't usually travel incognito. She usually has her full F1 garb, but today it's in Pennsylvania. Yeah, awesome. All right, so Susie, So Susie, the last time we met, I'd never been to a Formula One race. I was a little embarrassed to tell Susie that. I was one of the sponsors of the team, but I've now gone. So I went to the Formula One race in Tokyo, just about regained my hearing. So if you need me to speak up, let me know, because that must be, talk about workers' comp, that must be, must be quite a challenge. Anyway, I was very impressed. You know, talk to us a little bit, what is it like to be a driver on the Williams team?
First of all, thank you very much all for coming today. Like Linda said, my luggage did get lost. I normally do look a little bit more like a racing driver, so please excuse that. But it's really great to be here in Atlanta. It's my first time in Atlanta, and like Linda said, we had some great events in Canada around the Montreal weekend, and I love the events. For me, being in quite a male-dominated world, to be surrounded by so many successful women, it was really something inspirational for me as well. So it's great to be here this morning and see so many of you here with me. And I'm very lucky that I'm doing a job that I love, a job that I dreamed of since I was a very little girl. It all started when I started racing karts, and like Linda said, I progressed through the ranks. And when I look back now, and when people say to me, well, why did you want to be a racing driver? It was simply my passion. It was something I loved doing. I was incredibly lucky to get the support of my parents. My father has a motorbike shop, and actually my mother met my father when she went into the shop to buy her first bike. So the genes were there. Motorsport was in the blood, so that was a good start. But I got a lot of support from my parents. But for my mum, it was always important that I studied and that school work went very well. So I did end up going to university to study, I think, international business, the standard course you do when you're not quite sure what you want to do. And after 2 years, I decided that I wanted to pursue my dream of being a racing driver. So I made the difficult decision to quit my studies. My mum immediately said, okay, but you can always go back and finish it. And I said, yeah, Mum, I'm going to go back and finish it in a few years, knowing that there was no way I was going back. But I took the chance. There were some tough moments along the way, but I ended up becoming a Mercedes-Benz Works driver in a touring car championship, and I was there 7 years, and that then led me to being picked up by the Williams Formula One team. And I'm incredibly proud to be part of a team like Williams. They are a real racers team. Everything is about the performance of the car. And I think a lot of you are maybe not so aware of Formula One just now in the US. We hope that's going to change after
this morning.
Yeah, after this morning, definitely, and after the race in Austin especially. But Formula One is in worldwide, maybe not so much in the US, is the top motorsport category in the world. It's groundbreaking. Whatever they develop in Formula One quite often gets put into road cars in 4 or 5 years' time. And being part of the team was a dream come true for me. I'm getting to work with some of the best engineers in the world, 500 employees in the factory, all focusing on building 2 of the fastest racing cars they can. So it's quite inspirational to be part of that and to be the racing driver that gets to get in the car, drive it as fast as I can, and give the team feedback. So for me, it was a dream come true, and I'm relishing every moment in the team.
And who do you look to for inspiration, Susie? There are so few women in your field. Who do you look to as a role model? Who do you derive inspiration from?
It's a question I get asked a lot, and it's a difficult one for me to answer, because most certainly when I was growing up, there was never a female that I could aspire to, because there was never a female that had achieved what I wanted to achieve. But when I look back on it now, I think my biggest inspiration at the time was actually the women in my family, my mother and my grandmother, because they instilled in me the belief as a young girl that I could do whatever I put my mind to. Obviously, as a young 8-year-old or 12-year-old or 14-year-old, there was hardly any other girls my age racing in karts. But my mother never made me feel like I was doing something different. She never pointed out that, well, take care, you're only a little girl, and you know, don't crash. Or she never ever gave me the feeling that I was doing anything different. So for me, I was just doing something that I loved doing. And I had a very big help in the fact that my older brother was also racing, and I was one of those girls that said, well, if he can do it, I can do it. And many people assume when I first jumped in a kart that I was super quick and blew all the boys away, but actually the truth is quite somewhat different. The first ever time I drove a kart, we went as a family to the kart track, I did a couple of laps. I got pushed around out on the track. They were all coming past me much quicker. I said, whoa.
That happens to me every morning, so I can understand what that's like.
And I came into the pits and I said to my dad, bah, I don't like that. That's really, I was getting hit. They were much faster. And he said, Toots. That was always his nickname for me, Toots. We have two options now. We put the cart back in the truck and we go home. It's no problem. Or you go back out there, you try and go faster, and when they hit you, you're going to hit them back twice as hard. I think you can guess which option I went for. So yeah, going back to your question, I think there was no clear role model for me, but in some sense, my mother and my grandmother, who was also a very strong lady, they kind of gave me that feeling that you can achieve whatever you put your mind to, no matter if it's male-dominated world or not. Just do what makes you happy.
And Susie, do you think that you're bringing a whole new fan base to F1? Have you noticed younger girls showing an interest in what you're doing? And
without a doubt, and for me, I've always said, when everybody says to me, you're blazing the trail and you're breaking down the barriers, I keep saying, no, wait, I've got so much more I want to achieve before I can say I've broken down barriers. But for me, it's so good to see when a little girl comes to me, to put another aspect to the story. The racing car I drive in DTM is pink. The sponsor, it was always white, and the sponsor had the great idea that we want the car to be pink because it's a great marketing tool. I wasn't that happy about the decision, but kind of got over it. But one very positive side effect was these little girls dressed head to toe in pink coming to me and saying, are you the girl in the pink car? And I would always say, yeah, I'm the girl in the pink car, and I got quite proud of it, actually. And many fathers came to me and said, they would watch the racing on the television and their daughters were never interested until they could see a pink car out on the track. And I think they think it's either Barbie or Hello Kitty. But that was a very positive side effect. And that really made me feel quite proud that this small thing of turning the car pink, no matter if it was a cliche blonde girl in a pink car, it really inspired many young little girls who would never normally be interested in racing or even coming to a race. So that was a very positive side effect. And in that sense, I do feel now that maybe it's good just to show women or girls who maybe didn't quite think that motorsport was their thing, that actually there are women there who are doing something good in motorsport. And as a team at Williams, I'm the development driver, the only driver in Formula One now. On the board, we have a CFO who's female. We have Claire Williams, the daughter of the founder, who sits on the board. She's head of marketing. And motorsport is a very performance-based sport. If you're not good enough, you simply won't last because there's too many people aspiring to get there, and it's too fast-paced and performance-based that if you're not good enough, you simply will get replaced. So the fact that you can turn on a TV screen and see more women at the highest level of motorsport, I think inspires women to kind of think, okay, it's possible.
Great. And Susie, what advice do you have to the women here in the room who are perhaps making their way up the leadership chain or trying to kind of take their place at a table where there are a lot more men than women around the table? What would be your advice?
Well, we actually saw from the events we did in Canada that as much as mine is a sports male-dominated world, it's very similar to what you're also facing in your workplaces. And I think, first of all, you're all here, so you all have a level of success already, so I think you're doing a good job as it is. But my advice was always, or if I look back and try and understand how I managed to get to where I wanted to go, it's a couple of factors. The first thing is being passionate about what you do. I'm very lucky, but I followed my passion and I'm doing my dream job. But I think if you have a passion for something, it's much easier to be successful because you can dedicate much more to it. You can get up in the morning and know you're doing something you love. It's not about going to an office and thinking, oh, God, another day at work. So the passion really helps. And the second thing is just believing in yourself. There was many times when people said, you're never going to make it. There was many moments in my career where I thought to myself, how am I going to make it? There's so much odds against me making it. Two moments stand out when I was nominated for Young Driver of the Year award, a very big award in Europe. And I lost 2 years in a row. And I spent when it was announced, I spent those nights crying in my hotel room. But when I look back now, actually, the guys who won the awards are not racing anymore. So maybe it was good that I didn't win. But there are always going to be very, very tough moments. And there are always going to be moments where you think to yourself, am I doing the right thing? Is it just believe in yourself? Know from that gut feeling inside that you're on the right path. You're doing something that you want to do. And no matter how tough it gets, just never lose that belief in yourself.
That's terrific. Susie, thank you so much for sharing your story, and I wish you and your team good luck in Austin this weekend.
Thank you very much.
All right, keep your fingers crossed, please. All right, I'd now like to invite Sonia. So, that's clearly a chair designed for men. I'd like to invite Sonia Hines to the stage. Sonia is Vice President of Human Resources with Randstad, and she will be introducing our panelists this morning.
Hello and good morning, everyone. I'm excited to be here with you this morning to introduce you to our group of panelists. We have an outstanding group joining us this morning representing a variety of industries and points of view. So let's quickly meet our expert panel. So joining us this morning is Pat Falautico. She's the Vice President of Sales Center Transformation for IBM. A 27-year executive with the company, Pat also serves as the Senior State Executive for Georgia and the Senior Location Executive for Atlanta. Pat's passionate about giving back to her local community. She also sits on the board of the United Way. She will chair the United Way's Greater Atlanta campaign for 2013. In addition, Pat has recently been named Possible Woman of the Year by Wind Enterprises. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Pat Falautico to our panel. Next, we have Stacey Hagan. Stacey is Chief People Officer and Executive Vice President of Corporate Processes for Earthlink Incorporated. Stacey's overall responsibilities include people strategy design and human resources. She has a deep and keen understanding of business restructuring, mergers and acquisitions, workforce restructuring, and change management. Stacey sits on the board of directors and the executive committee for the Technology Association of Georgia and the Human Resources Leadership Forum. Please join me in welcoming Stacey Hagan to our panel. As Chief Executive Officer of the Girl Scouts of Greater Atlanta, Marilyn Midyett oversees the Council's fundamental mission of developing the next generation of future business and civic female leaders. In 2010, Marilyn was the recipient of the Womanetics POW Award, which is given to women here in Georgia who have exemplified great excellence in leadership, not only in their community and in the business world as well. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Marilyn Midyett to our panel this morning. And last but certainly not least, Dr. Pamela Scully. Dr. Scully is the professor and chair of the Department of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at Emory University. Dr. Scully's most recent research focuses on the relevance of history and feminist theory while ensuring the rights of women in a post-conflict society. She's the author of several books, she's the author of several books exploring gender and currently serves as the deputy editor of the Women's History Review. In addition, she sits on the board of several editorial journals, and she is the current editor of the Women's History Journal magazine. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. Pamela Scully. Okay, and everyone, if you could please join me in giving all of our panelists and Susie a warm round of applause as I turn it back over to Linda Gallipo for the first round of questions. Linda?
Thank you. All right. Thank you all for being with us this morning. I thought to get the conversation started, we'd start with kind of a why should we bother question. So it's I think it's a well-recognized fact. I don't think I'm surprising anybody here when I say that men are still far more present in top leadership positions than women. What are the benefits of having more women in these roles? Stacey, would you like to start?
Sure. In companies in particular, which is where I happen to be, as opposed to not-for-profit and so forth. First of all, it's part of reflecting your market place in your leadership. And having that diversity of perspective at the leadership level of the company, I think, makes a huge difference. If you look at consumer-focused businesses rather than B2Bs as an example, the statistics are something like women do 80% of the buying. They make the buying decisions for families, as an example. So if you aren't thinking about issues, if your company's not addressing the marketplace with that women's perspective in mind, you're absolutely going to fall behind. So I think it's really just that diversity of perceptions that makes it so important. But I think we can take that a step further as well and look at the role and the power of corporations in the world and in society for helping to correct some of the wrongs that are out there. Human rights issues globally, fighting for education for all people, as an example, health care, and those types of services for people globally, where it's amazing today the conditions that people still live under. And I think that having more women perspectives, and frankly just diverse perspectives at the leadership level of any company, will with time influence how much corporations and frankly their financial strength becomes involved in that kind of change in the human rights arena.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Marilyn, what would you like to add?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think the short answer is, if you're just exclusively opportunistic, is that I think we've all seen the studies that Catalyst have done, Financial Times, The Economist, and it shows by far and above those businesses that have women on the boards and women in senior executive roles far outperform on the bottom line than those who do not. And I tend to think it's because women, I believe, and we've done a lot of research on this, have a lot more holistic and multi-dimensional perspectives on problem solving. I think everybody in this room would identify with the fact that we tend to want to engage people in solutioning and bringing folks along. As a result of that, I think we can often develop deeper relationships with employees who then engage on a much more deeper, committed level that really help produce those bottom line results.
Absolutely. And Pamela, I know that this is not an issue that is limited to business. I know in academia it's also a very prevalent issue. What would you like to say?
Well, I would endorse exactly what my colleagues have said, is that, you know, I think more than 50% of the world is actually female, it makes no sense to not have them represented at the highest levels. And I think also, I'm doing a leadership course at Emory, where I'm learning a lot and I have been humbled that I actually have a lot to learn from business. And I have learned a lot. And one thing that's really clear is in the world we're living in now, which is such a globalized world, we have to communicate with people from other countries, different languages, that research has shown that women have exactly the kind of attributes, not to get too stereotypical, but what you were saying, that women are good at emotional intelligence, which is, you know, empathizing, trying to understand where someone's coming from, and that in a world where we're having to communicate more and more with people who didn't grow up where one grew up, and, you know, I'm an obvious example, so you can hear from my accent, that having the ability and not being scared to admit that you're wrong, being willing to learn and saying, I don't know all the answers, which I think women tend to be a little less controlling about knowing everything. I think it really makes sense, and absolutely in academia. I mean, and academia faces the same challenges of men tend to get promoted more often, there are fewer women in leadership positions, so we face the same challenges.
Absolutely. All right, Pat, I'll have you comment on my next question, because a number of our panelists have talked about research done, and the March issue of the Harvard Business Review cited a study, a very interesting study done by two men. It was a study of 7,000 leaders, and they measured these leaders, men and women, for 16 different attributes. And what was very interesting, in all but one of the attributes, women outperformed the men. So were demonstrated as having higher levels of competency in 15 of these 16 leadership attributes, which is very interesting. And in 4, they were significantly higher. And this is very much supported by many other research studies that come to precisely the same conclusion. But if that is the case, why are there so few women in these high leadership roles? What's wrong?
I think there's lots of possible answers to that. First of all, I think there's elements of decisions that we make for ourselves. There have been more and more younger women who may have decided, I don't want that. The attractiveness of the C-suite has probably lost some of its luster. And do I really want to put myself into an environment that is not necessarily as nurturing? So I think in some cases, people are looking at that and saying, I don't want that in my life, and saying no, even though I've got the capabilities to do it. I really am not willing to put myself in that kind of an environment. At the other end of the table, we can actually change that complexion if we take that risk and go there. I think there's also an element of sponsorship. You know, we talk so much about, you know, the importance of sponsorship and having that person who pulls you along. And really nurturing that kind of a relationship, I think, is very, very important. And then it's all the question of, have we been tested sufficiently? Have we been given the opportunities to take a chance, perhaps make mistakes, and not have them be fatal? So I had read a quote just recently, wouldn't it be nice if we think of things as mistakes and learning versus failure? Because failure really carries with it so many negative connotations. So I think all of those things together are things that are still preventing women from getting to where they need to be.
And Pat, do you think that women experience failure or think about failure differently than men? Why does that plague us more?
I guess it comes back from, you know, the more women participate in sports at young ages, perhaps they get over that a lot earlier. Yeah. And because
Susie's
boys
like,
are just,
oh
right,
yeah.
Susie? You know, boys are just wired to compete that way, and you win some days and you learn and you lose some days, and you just get stronger for it. And I think more organized sports for girls at younger ages is going to help us with all of that. My daughter would hit me over the head for that one because she's a dancer, and she tells me the same thing applies. It doesn't have to be just team sports, but I think it may come from some of the nurturing that we feel failure more deeply. I think guys tend to brush it off a little bit easier.
It's very interesting. Pamela, what are your thoughts on this question?
I mean, again, I agree with everything Pat said. I think in America, we tend to think about failure and success very individually, you know, so you've made it or you haven't made it, and I don't think we pay enough attention to structure, the structures of what would support certain people to be successful. So I do think, looking at America in comparison to Europe or elsewhere, is that we haven't been good about creating the structural conditions that allow, well, let's say those women who want to have children, for example, to succeed and have children and not have to make choices. So I think women are often faced with choices that are really impossible choices, and they get talked about as if women choose family over, let's say, promotion. And that's not true. It's in a horrible world where we're not supported as mothers. We have to, you know, we choose that, but it doesn't mean that if there wasn't a structure that had childcare at work and really supported people being parents, that we would choose to be only mothers. So I think I agree. So there are things that could be changed that people have to take leadership in. And so, for example, I think, you know, having childcare at work for people who have young children, just as a de facto thing that happens, would be fantastic. I think a bit of, you know, more maternity leave, paternity leave. Although I was saying to Isabel from the racing team that they've also done these really interesting studies, and we're actually experiencing this at Emory. But for example, in Denmark, where they have wonderful structural, you know, everybody gets to have your paternity leave, maternity leave, and you can stay at home for a year, et cetera, et cetera. What they discovered was that when the women take maternity leave, they do what they were supposed to, you know, why they took maternity leave was to stay at home and look after the baby, and they hung out with their baby and got to enjoy them, and then they went back to work a year later. And what the guys did was they outsourced the childcare and went off hunting or whatever. and what we found in academia is the same thing applies, so that we've actually found this at Emory. We have very nice policies at Emory, thanks to women in leadership who took action on saying we need to support people who want to have children. But we found the same thing. The women stayed home and looked after their infant, and the guys outsource the childcare and write a book. And so the men keep on being promoted at quicker rates because they've got the book. And the women say, yes, but the whole reason was to look after the baby. Anyway, so.
That's hilarious. Stacey, what are your thoughts?
Well, I also agree with everything I've heard so far. If I go back to that article that you referenced first, when I saw that, I immediately wanted to question the 16 or 17 characteristics that they had on the list. Are they really the leadership characteristics that are most critical, or are they biased in some ways, and therefore women are scoring higher in this particular sampling? You know, so and part of the reason why I say that is, I think if you look at sort of any given era, economic issues, political issues that are creating challenges for business will change the shape of the characteristics required of leaders. So I think that the survey could very much be influenced by our times, but in the end, I do think that men and women bring different qualities to leadership, and that's why a blend is best. It's sort of like if you would like to have a whole brain at the table making these kinds of decisions, we should make sure that we bring these diverse perspectives in. And to your point, if women, and yours as well, aren't pursuing these roles because of the structure of jobs and companies, then we have to, that will increasingly become a business issue that companies cannot live with because they won't be able to compete. So, and I think, frankly, the younger generation and the use of technology is already driving massive change in the way we think about work, where it gets done, in what hours, you know, what kinds, how fast you can do things, how collaborative. So even if you're separated globally. So I think that we're living in an interesting time of the redefinition of work that will create more flexibility and possibility for women.
Absolutely. Pat, when we spoke on the phone earlier this week, last week, it's all a blur. Last week.
It is.
You know, you raised the issue of networking, and it's interesting. So I looked into that issue, and there's lots written about how men and women network differently. So women are great at building vast networks and really leveraging those networks for information exchange and for, you know, really building a strong personal network. Men, however, are much more strategic about using their network to further their career, further their business contacts. Very interesting. It's something that I actually hadn't thought about before, but it's very well supported in the literature. Tell us more about that.
It is very interesting. And I have a junior in college right now, and he innately has figured out this networking thing. I didn't teach it to him, but he's figured it out. And I think women value this support structure, and we hold it precious and say, this is something that I'm pulling support from, and I'm not going to trade on it. I'm going to respect you. I'm not going to ask you to do something for me. And what's interesting in all of that is what people value is to be able to take advantage of you and put you in positions of power and influence that will help promote them as well. So when you don't ask for the opportunity to leverage this relationship, you also deprive somebody else of taking advantage of what you can bring to the table. So I will find in many situations, we'll go to receptions and there's people passing cards and talking about business deals or perhaps job opportunities. And women may be talking more about what's going on in the community and might be talking more about what's going on in the family. And I think we need to get comfortable to say it's okay to make that next ask. Any new opportunities coming up where we might be able to work together? Any positions that you see on the horizon where I might be able to fill a role that will help you in the future? And I think that it's just getting comfortable making that next ask.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Marilyn, you know, I would imagine that networking is a big part of what you do. So what are your views on this?
I agree with Pat completely, and I think everybody in this room has probably seen it at work when you think about it, asking your friends for something or your professional network for something is often viewed as taking advantage of the relationship. But the reality is we see this at work all the time because men view this as the process. They embrace it as the process. I think a great example, because I'm in the nonprofit world now, but spent almost 30 years in the for-profit world, is just think about this, asking for money and fundraising. A lot of women think that's impolite. They would view that as opportunistic, and they would think of that as taking advantage if they were asked to give money or if you asked them to give money. Yet men see that as the currency of commerce. They expect to be asked for it. They expect to give it. They know it's how the world works. And that's why, for example, the Boy Scouts in the United States is funded 4 times to 1 for women.
Really?
So I certainly don't hesitate to share that with the CEOs in town because to Stacy's point, to Pamela's point, we represent 51% of society. We're controlling many of the purse strings. And if you really want to make the best decisions, then you've got to have everybody at the table. And for us, we've got to get more comfortable with the way that works. And there's no shame in it at all. In fact, I view it when I go out and fundraise, I view it as asking people or giving them the honor and the privilege to invest in an initiative that has significant consequences and value. Totally different thing than saying, will you give me a couple of bucks, right?
Right. Fascinating. I now want to turn the subject a little bit more to how we help women kind of along their way. And I'll share just a personal anecdote. So I've worked for Randstad for 17 years. I know I don't look it, but in 17 years. And, you know, it's very interesting. You know, Randstad is a classic example of a pyramid where you see lots of women at the bottom. Like probably, you know, our chief people officer likes to quote the number of 62.7. So we are, in the US, we're a 62.7% female organization. And less in the US, but certainly more globally. We see that as you go up the pyramid, there are fewer and fewer women. And certainly I have attended for years global leadership meetings. And, you know, if there's a dance, I'm going to charge because I'm like one of 3 women in the room, right? And the rest are all men. And I vividly remember about 5 years ago, because diversity is something that Randstad takes very seriously. So they've done lots to change that. They're aware of that. But sometimes the how-to is quite different. And I vividly remember about 5 years ago, the head of diversity for ABN AMRO came to speak to us. A very candid British lady, and she'd been kind of prepped for the group she was about to meet. And we asked her to speak to us about diversity, but I guess, you know, who was prepping her said, you know, we really don't have a problem with women. You know, this percentage of our company is women, so we'd like you to talk a little bit more about other forms of diversity. And then she appears in front of the heads of all the countries, and she basically said, I think the biggest problem that you have is you have a complete lack of awareness. How very interesting that you told me what a women-dominated company you are, and, you know, there are 3 or 4 of us here in this room. So, you know, that really got our company to thinking, if we fill the pipeline, what's going wrong? What's going wrong? What is failing to happen? So, you know, many companies have used strategies like mentorships and sponsorships to help guide women up the chain and to encourage them, because rightly so, very often women are kind of counting themselves out. What experience do you have with that in your own organizations or that you're aware of? And what advice could you give to people here who are perhaps looking at that type of program within their own company? Stacy, can I start with you?
Sure. So I serve as a mentor and have for several years in some women's development, outside of my company, but women's development programs. And I also have been a part for many years. Actually, I'm the 5th generation in my family to be a part of a women's organization that's all about sponsoring education for other women. And it was founded at a time when it was really unusual for a woman to be able to earn an advanced degree. So it was really a rare breed. But so I believe in all that. Now, I take immense amounts of bashing from my husband for all this women's stuff you guys do. If men did all the stuff to support each other that all you women do, you would not tolerate it. And I'm like, well, that's because we've got to counter the balance, and I can make all the arguments in the world, but he's right. I mean, ultimately, he is right. And so when I think about programs inside of companies and how you can think about, I think we really have to look at mentoring people generally, men and women, but bringing into that kind of a program an appreciation for the differences, the different work styles, the different decision-making approaches. And again, once you start dividing it between men and women, you tend to get stereotypical. It doesn't apply to everybody in those categories, but I think it is further informed by the generational research that's going on today, so that when we look at mentoring programs and sponsorship programs inside of companies, where one generation is trying to help coach and bring along another generation, it's yet another opportunity to really educate and help people appreciate the different perspectives that people have. And so that, I think, becomes the more powerful element for the organization's culture, is the mindset shift for all participants in the program, on the mentoring side or on the receiving side, in terms of understanding differences and the validity of those differences, and really gaining an appreciation for that, more so than a focus on, I'm going to help more women advance.
So Stacey, let me paraphrase what I think you're saying. You're saying you believe in that type of program, but you feel that they should have a gender-neutral face to them. Is that what you're saying?
Right. Okay. I think so. And it's diversity. As soon as you say that word, then you start to trigger a whole bunch of other notions for people. Sometimes I think the generational research and those differences creates a safe place to talk about, you know what, everyone has a different set of experiences that help shape them, and they're bringing that with them into your organization, and that is valuable. So how do you capitalize on that?
Pat.
I am also a very big mentor and protege, and I value both sides of those relationships. But I think there's one other, going to your point earlier about the structural differences. Helping women, helping anyone get ahead also has an element of advocacy. And where a mentor can be very helpful in helping you strategize or helping you develop certain skills, they also have to, if they can't, you also have to have somebody else who's at the table who's willing to advocate on your behalf. One of the things that I liked the most about our promotion pipeline is a practice that we exercise called a 5-minute drill, and it's not 5 minutes. But what it does is it brings a group of senior leaders together, and they talk about people ready to move and opportunities that are opening up in the next 3 months, let's just say, usually facilitated by a human resources partner who is looking at the balance of the slate and saying, well, look at all of the people who are ready to move. We don't have enough diversity on this list. What are we doing in our pipeline that we might be able to improve the opportunity for everyone to compete for these jobs? Or, as we look at some of these open jobs and saying, I can sit at that table and say, well, did you know Stacey is really a great fit for that job because we've given her these 3 opportunities. Nobody else at the table knew Stacey. So it requires that advocacy at the table as well.
Absolutely. And you know what, I'll just expand on that a little bit, and Pamela, I'll ask you to give your thoughts. So when we were doing this panel in Canada, there was a professor of women's studies from Ryerson University, which is a university in Ontario, and she talked about that very issue, and she said that the study that she'd done had been who applies for what jobs. So she gave examples of positions and how kind of men and women apply, and she said that what we noticed is men think nothing of applying for a job many levels above their current level, for which they are uniquely unqualified. And then, you know, some of their female counterparts who are utterly qualified don't apply, sometimes for some of the issues we talked about earlier, but sometimes it's you know, oh, on qualification number 14, I don't have 0.6,
Exactly.
right?
Exactly.
And she said that's really a problem that organizations face. It's getting them to actually throw their hat in the ring.
Actually, I completely agree, and so absolutely, and empirically, I think that's correct too. And so one of the things I do as a professor, and it blends things that everybody was talking about, is one of the things I do is if I see not just young women, but primarily young women, since I work in women's studies, if I see people with potential, I tell them, you know, in their first year, I went to one of my students the other day, she's 18, and I said, you know, you need to apply for the Rhodes Scholarship when you're 21. So you think about that. And she said, I would never have thought. And so I think it's about imagination. You have to be able to help people imagine themselves differently in those kind of positions. Absolutely. And in turn, I mean, actually finding this somewhat autobiographically relevant is that over the last few years, I've been asked to sort of step into certain leadership positions. And honestly, at the time, it's like it wouldn't have occurred to me. It would not have occurred to me to even think that I could do that. Next thing, I was completely terrified. And then I just thought, well, someone has to do it, and it was exactly, I can learn. So I think when you have to be willing to fail, and maybe sometimes pretend that you know what you're doing, or you know, at least pretend you look, you know.
For years.
That one grows. And then the final thing I would say that's been very helpful to me is, as part of this leadership program at Emory, and it's not just women, it's men and women, and we are being taught skills that we wouldn't have learned otherwise. And academia is just hopeless in teaching people skills. Everybody's just learning on the job when you get to administration. But actually learning about how to do finances and how the universities run has been incredibly helpful, so that one can start to imagine that one could maybe do something. And then the final thing is, personally, I've looked at the women in leadership positions who I admire, thought, well, you know, who am I to ask them for coffee? And I thought, well, you know, they can always say no. And what's turned out, it's been really, really helpful to have someone who I admire. And for me, actually, I love fashion. So the couple of people at Emory at the higher levels who I thought, okay, I could imagine being in higher administration, but I don't, you know, I like fashion, I like long skirts, scarves. So I want to be the person I am. And if I can't be who I am, then I don't want to do the job. So I picked out a couple of women who just seemed sympathetic to my version of fashion and had good handbags and things, and went to them and just said, you know, it looks to me like you are exactly yourself in this position of high authority. How have you done it? And they told me, and I thought, well, okay, if you can do it, then maybe I could imagine. But I think really expanding one's imagination of possibility is really crucial.
I think that's a fantastic point. Help them imagine who they could be. Marilyn, my next question, I'll start with you. So very famous, much talked about article in the Atlantic magazine, Why Women Still Can't Have It All. Mm-hmm. So in that, Anne-Marie Slaughter says we should stop fooling ourselves, that work-life balance is a myth. She characterizes the cliched formulas for success frequently used. I put career first, this kind of thing, kind of poo-poos all of that and says we really need to face the reality that that's a myth and that's not happening and we can't have it all. What are your thoughts on this? Can we have it all?
Well, it seems like that's the raging debate, and I think that balance is in the eye of the beholder, so it's self-defined based on what your expectations are. And I look at balance, at least in my own life, is not day to day. If I consider every relationship I have and every responsibility that I have, on any given day, you're not going to find balance in my life if the expectation is I'm being equal part mother, I'm being equal part daughter, I'm being equal part employee, et cetera, et cetera. So I tend to look at things as seasons. In one quarter, I may hunker down because I've got some major initiatives at work that I need to get accomplished. Another quarter, I'm going to say, you know what, I'm a community servant, and so these are the initiatives that I'm undertaking this quarter. Another quarter, it's going to be, you know, my kids are getting ready to go off to college, and I want to be present for that. So, and I don't want to have anybody walk out the room and say it's got to be quarter by quarter, but I think you get the drift that it's really relative to seasons, and I think the whole debate around this balance comes in when we start talking about caregiving. And you don't see this debate until that element gets introduced into the conversation. But I think in fairness to even men, if in their definition of balance, it was to include being primarily responsible for caregiving, you wouldn't hear any men saying that they felt like they had the traditional sense of balance as well. So I've just been lucky when I hear about all the women speaking, whether it's mentorship or sponsorship. I've been blessed to have both. I've been blessed to have a husband who always believed that he carried the responsibility for 50% of the domestic obligations in life. And so I really am concerned about people feeling like they have to define balance based on anybody else's definition. I think it's got to be what works for you. You still have to be able to get the job done. You still have to be able to produce good results, but you have to find a way that creates that balance for yourself. And in my own personal opinion, anytime you start seeing people gravitate to the extremes, that's when we get locked into this hyperbole and discussion that at the end of the day doesn't become overly productive for anyone. But we do need, you know, women can't be that which they can't see. I think Pamela talked about it. It's kind of like acting acting until you can become thinking in a different way. And when you look at why there aren't more women in the executive roles, you can't be that which you can't see. And if people, to Pat's point, are not aspiring to be in those positions because they perhaps perceive that the sacrifices that have been made are more than they want to make, that's when they start opting out. And one of the things that's been gratifying for me is we have a research institute that a lot of people don't know about. We've actually studied at what point in life do girls and boys' perspective of leadership begin to diverge. Because early on, up until about the age of 10, they're the same. At the age of 11, you begin to hear boys define leadership in terms of being the boss, making more money, and having power. If you ask girls at that same age, much of their definition of leadership is going to be around sharing skills, helping develop people, change management for the greater good, and it's much more altruistic in terms of how they define leadership. So we have all of that going on, and then just trying to make it ourselves in a world that's not always conducive.
Absolutely, fantastic. Pat, work-life balance, is it a myth? Can we have it all?
I think that the idea of that we can manage it in balance is a myth. I mean, that whole image that it's always going to be even is a myth. Because, and when we tell our daughters and the young women that are coming after us that you can get it like this, we are perpetuating a myth. Because, as Marilyn said, there are some days when things are up and things are down. You know, my dad suffered with a real challenging illness over the last year, and there were days I had to be daughter first, mother last, executive second somewhere in there, and then somewhere fill in the community responsibilities. So I think of it as navigating work and life and all of the other responsibilities. And yes, you can do it all, do all you choose to do. You have to be highly scheduled and organized, but you have to be able to navigate around the potholes. You know, in the middle of a conference call, or coming to this meeting and being told you have this conference call at 7, you've got to be able to navigate around those potholes to continue to fulfill your obligations. And we have to acknowledge that it is hard, right? We have to stop making it look easy. Let's acknowledge the fact that it's hard. I mean, how many times when my son was young, he's 21 now, that we were in New York at the time, that I had to commute an extra hour to drop him at my sister-in-law's, who was at home with her child, caring for mine. That's the child care of choice, was an extra hour of commute in and out. So 6 a.m. leaving the house, 8 p.m. getting home, clean him, wash him, feed him, put him to bed, and then collapse. Did that for 2 years. It wasn't easy. It wasn't easy. My relationship with my husband was probably the thing that had to fall to the bottom at that time. So the concept of balance, if we try to make it think like this, doesn't exist. But if we get really skilled at navigating the potholes, I think we can figure out a way to have it all.
Very interesting.
Can I just say something? Yes. I loved her article, but I did think that the title was probably not her title, which I think was Women Can't Have It All. And I actually saw her, Anne-Marie Slaughter's article, actually much more as a critique of the professions in the United States, which had sort of not taken on the issue that people really do have lives where they have to care for people, whether they are parents, whether they are children, but that the professions in America, and I do see this as a failure of feminism, just went for, that the solution was to make sure that women and men had equal opportunity to be lawyers, executives, etc., but didn't solve some of these really systemic problems. So what's interesting is in many of the listservs, the women's studies, feminist listservs that I belong to, people hated that article. I thought it was a lovely article. I thought it was a brave, lovely article that talked about the reality of people's lives and sort of was asking professions to step up a bit more in terms of maybe enhancing flexibility, providing childcare, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And just to the point of work-life balance, Dr. Emery talks about work-life integration, which I think somehow makes it more easy to sort of think about it. And I think navigating is also the point. And what I tell my students is, I don't think you can have it all at once, but maybe over the long haul in a life you can. And so that also settles things. If you can't do it right this minute, maybe you do need to be thinking mostly about your work and your kids for a few years, and then you can start emerging. And I do think that also has to do with leadership, is that my children are now older, and I'm beginning to think I could, flourish in a different way. But I couldn't imagine that 5 years ago. I was just like going to work and looking after kids. Now they're getting older, but I think men invest a lot of energy in leadership and everything at young age. They're 20s, 30s, 40s, and when they get to their 50s, they've like had their career and they're ready to kind of get all warm and cozy. And I think a lot of women who've had kids will go, okay, no, I've been there for everybody else. This is my time. So I think women, if we think about women on a different leadership track, that it just is a different timeline. I think there are opportunities for women to be leaders, but maybe not when, the standard timeline, which is the male timeline.
Terrific. All right, before we open up to questions, because I would imagine there's some questions in the room, and I think we have a Twitter feed. We're allowing people to ask us some questions, so I want to have a chance for our panelists to be able to answer some of these questions. In closing, I would just like to ask each of you, what advice do you have, either for the women in the room or for our daughters, for young women setting out on their career, something that we can take away with us and will help us as we forge ahead? Pat, can I start with you?
Yeah, I try to continue to remind myself to be myself, not try to change my values, change who I am in order to fit the situation that's demanding of me. So, simple example. There are times in our quarters where my boss will be going off to a meeting on Monday, and he wants a conference call on Sunday morning. And when I start to say yes, and I just say, but I'm supposed to be taking my daughter to church on Sunday morning. You just need to remember that if you start trading on who you are, it's really not going to work out in the long term. So try to keep yourself true to yourself.
That's fantastic advice. Stacy.
I completely agree with that, and I think it ties into defining what having it all means to you, right? Because I think that for many of us, my mother never worked outside the home. So when you start thinking about your role models for being a mother and then your role model for being a career professional, you're having to make up a lot of things. And so you look to those people that you admire and you start to emulate, but that's not you either. So I completely agree. But I just had to build off of that, but I actually had another thought I would throw out there, and it's because my daughter is graduating from college, and so she's interviewing now and looking for, what's that job going to be. And I found myself telling this to her the other day, and it was one of the best pieces of advice anyone ever gave me. When it comes to your career, your work, there's really three things that matter. First, are you paid fairly? And I don't mean well or extravagantly, I just fairly for what you do and the contribution that it makes to the organization you're a part of. Because if you're not, that creates all kinds of problems. Secondly, do you enjoy and respect the people that you work with? Are they good people to be around? Ethics, integrity, the kinds of things that matter to all of us. And then thirdly, are you learning? Are you learning and growing? Are you challenged? And that those three things are really the only three things that matter for true job satisfaction, career satisfaction. Because we can pursue certain companies or certain titles or certain levels and all that and not have one of those pieces in place, or two or three, and find that we're terribly, terribly miserable and unhappy and needing to make a change. So that would be my advice, is that you find yourself tempted to move and it seems like you should and you ought to be doing something else by now, but are you paid fairly? Do you enjoy and respect the people that you work with? Are you learning and growing? That's really what matters.
Excellent. Marilyn.
So words of advice. Some of them may sound cliched, but they resonate with me. So work hard and play hard. Believe in yourself. Be willing to act yourself into a new way of thinking. And, you know, when people ask me, if you had to do it again, what would you do differently? I'd probably not be afraid of failure. I probably would ask people to advocate for me, and I probably would have asked for more money sooner. Because I ultimately did it, and it was amazing what happened.
So I wholeheartedly endorse everything that my colleagues have said. I think for me, what's been crucial is finding someone I could go and, someone that I aspired, you know, in a position that I aspire to be in, and asking them to just tell me their life story and how they did it and what they could. So I think mentoring and being, and really having the nerve to, really when I emailed this person to ask for coffee, I just thought, this is just so, like, they're so busy, they're not going to want to, but, you know, so just doing it was really crucial. And I think something, you know, Susie said also, I think passion. If you really, really love what you do, then you are going to be willing to take the risks of being a bit embarrassed or failing. And if you don't love it, it's really not worth it. I mean, you know, not seeing your kids as much as you'd like to or whatever is only worth it if you absolutely believe in what you're doing. And so something the president of Emory said at a meeting a few weeks ago, which says, don't ever take a job that you don't want to retire from. You know, so just taking a job to get into a leadership position, which echoes everything people have said, that's not going to make you happy. You have to go for the jobs that you really would love to do, even if they terrify the life out of you. So I think being brave, I guess.
Fantastic. All right, questions. Do we have any of the questions from our Twitter feed, or should we open it up to the audience first?
All right, let's start with the Twitter feed.
Okay.
All right,
Fire
first question from the Twitter feed that we got is, do you consider yourselves a role model?
Oh, that's a very good one. Do we consider ourselves to be role models? So who would like to try that? Stacy, do you want to give that a whirl?
Well,
Do you think of yourself that way?
Not on a daily basis, no, I don't think so. Mostly I'm just trying to get through whatever I'm supposed to do that day. So, but you know, I do think that, especially, I think having a daughter, the age of my daughter and my son as well, that, and I keep talking about generational research. There's a lot of research that they look to their parents as role models and heroes. So whether we like it or not, we probably better take that seriously. But you know, I think that all of us, no matter what our level and what we're doing, can provide inspiration and guidance and perspective to other people. So I think when you're sought out for that role, share everything that you can, regardless of whether you think about yourself in that role.
Marilyn, that must be a big issue for you, given your position. I mean, I'm sure these girls are looking for role models.
Sure. And we talk about it in staff all the time, that if the Girl Scout mission is to build girls of courage, confidence, and character who make the world a better place, and if our business model to do that, whether it be volunteers or the programs or developing the girls, is about discovering and connecting and then taking action, then that means it starts with us. And what's amazing is that discover, connect, take action model. If you think about it, when we're sitting around the executive team table, we're looking at our strategic plan, we've created our annual operating plan, we've got performance development plans tied to everybody down the food chain. It's like we've got to discover what the barriers to success are. We've got to identify the resources, right? So connect in the community to identify the resources that are going to help solve those problems. And then we've got to take action with respect to that root cause analysis, securing the resources, and then executing to accomplish that ultimate mission. And so I think about that, I wake up thinking about that, and I go to bed thinking about that, because if our staff, even though we're less than 1/4% of an association or a council that's 60,000 people in the greater Atlanta area, if we don't set the example for best practices in those arenas, how can we say that we're really developing the next generation of business and female business and civic leaders who are going to be the employees, you know, today and tomorrow?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Excellent question. Other questions from the room? Yes.
I have a question for you. I came to the country when I was 20, and quit college, came to the country to get married, and I supported my husband and had a child. I've been in my company for 12 years, but I never move on to a leadership position because I don't have the college degree to back it up. Is my choice to go back to school, or can you make it in this country without a college degree?
That's a very good question. I mean, let's hear from some of the women on the panel, and that's a very U.S. question, I think, though I guess it applies in Europe as well, the importance of college degrees. Pat, could I make it at IBM without a college degree?
Certain jobs, yes, but most jobs, no. So I think really understanding where that line is drawn for certain job roles. One of the things that I do in the community is I focus on education with the Metro Chamber of Commerce. And one of the things that we have been focusing on is that more and more jobs in our future are going to require a post-secondary degree of some sort. Not necessarily a 4-year degree, but some level of certification beyond for most of the jobs that will be here in the United States. So if that opportunity presents itself and within the company that you're in, I would strongly support making that investment of time, because I think more and more jobs will require it in the future.
Yeah, and I can tell you, obviously, we are in the employment business, and you know, as you go through your life, it is far easier to not have an obstacle that you're going to have to overcome, or something that actually zaps your confidence. I think we've talked a lot today about confidence, and something like that is a liability that you feel like you're perpetually dealing with could really affect your confidence. And just a final point, if you look at unemployment in the U.S., we're all very familiar, you know, that we all, I imagine, have become fans of Jobs Friday, you know, more than ever before. The unemployment rate of the college educated is half that of the rest of the country. So you will have far fewer, probably, interruptions in your career, and far more choices with a college degree. So it's well worth it. And there are great online options today.
And I was just about to say, because, I mean, you know, university education is changing so profoundly. You could do, you know, 2 courses at night. There's just so many options now that would have really been difficult for you to get a degree, you know, 5 years ago. And now you could do it really quickly and fairly easily and actually quite cheaply. So, I mean, I would encourage you to do it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes. Hi.
I was a Girl Scout, and
Yay!
but I actually had Girl Scouts back in my day. But yeah, it was my first time of actually being competitive winning a badge.
Yes.
And I
Yeah.
I love your argument. And Ron, then, so thank you all for your time. That's number one. My question is actually threefold. Number one, I've always heard that women make about 70% of what men make. Is that still true?
Mm-hmm.
The second question is the grade of the workforce with women. How is it different than men? Men distinguish women or old ladies. I'm 52, so.
Mm-hmm.
And the third thing is with women in power, it seems like they always have this mark of they're just a witch, you know. Whereas men are determined.
Yes.
They're powerful and they're admired for having traits of of being a little rough. And so could anybody speak to those three things?
Yeah. Stacey, do you want to start with the compensation issue? That seemed to ring a bell.
Well, because I've been looking at that lately too, and I think there was a question during the presidential debates where the young lady referenced that women make 72% of what men make in terms of national average. That's right. However, if you say women in the same jobs as men, it's 90%. Okay, so still a problem. So number one, why are women making less overall? Now we have to look at education and preparedness for different types of jobs. We start to get into our educational system in science and technology and math and whether or not women are attracted to and prepared in the right areas to deal with that 72%. The 90%, okay, now we're in the same job, right? We're equally prepared. What's the problem there? And that's where I think the issue really needs to be focused. Here's a news statistic I heard just the other day that I thought was fascinating. First of all, you know that like 60% of college students today are women, and more than that of the master's graduates, it's far more than that are women. And women aged 22 to 30 today are making 8% more than their male counterparts in the same jobs. Okay? So this is moving. This is truly changing. And I think women in education, women pursuing their educations, preparing themselves for the right kinds of jobs, those are the things that are changing it. And this is a generation of young women who grew up with their mothers working and never thought that working wasn't an option. As we all talked about, we were all told you can sort of do whatever you want to do, right, Susie? And so I think I think we're seeing good movement there, and we need to police it in our organizations, and we need to make sure there are no unexplainable inequities, but I see good progress.
Excellent. Yeah. And what about the double standard? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Well, also, I mean, on a slightly more depressing note, there was recently a study done out of Harvard, where they took the curricula vitae of people who'd come up through the sciences, and all they did was change the name from a male name to a female name or vice versa. And it was exactly the identical CV and sent it out, and it was in the sciences. And I can't remember the percentage, but overwhelmingly, when it had a male name, the individual was rated more highly. They sent it out to a number of different people, and overwhelmingly, if it had male name, the person was seen as competent, excellent, and that literally just had to do with perception, not any reality. So I think there's a lot of work to be done. On the issue of the witches, I think of someone like Hillary Clinton, who for years was just, whatever you thought of her politics, people just hated her. And suddenly she's, I think, the most, favored politician the world has ever seen at the moment. And I think it is about stereotypes, because on the one hand, we have all this research that shows that women are in fact empathetic and more emotionally intelligent and kinder and all this thing, and yet they become witches when they get into leadership roles. Because they're stepping outside of conventional roles, and I think, and we see this in college evaluations of teaching. So, for example, I know from a previous life when I was teaching in another college, a colleague of mine who was female was absolutely fantastic, but she was, firm, and she expected people to do the work. She got the most terrible evaluations in terms of she's a bitch, she's horrible, blah. And another professor who I knew who was a male who was really not very good. I mean, he just wasn't very good, but he was very good at talking as if he knew what he was talking about. Got outstanding, evaluation from the students. And it was about perceptions, and we literally had to go to the provost and say, do you understand how these evaluations are truly affected by interpretations about what women should be doing and not? So women score very well as long as they're nurturing and kind to their students, and they're like mothers. The moment they sort of step out of a mothering role and start saying, you didn't do the work, you're going to fail, then they become, so I think the more women in the professions at leadership roles, maybe the less it'll be, but I think not to take the accusation of witch seriously. Just accept that that's...
It is a little, I'm sorry to interrupt, it is a little schizophrenic, because on the one hand, the traditional historical model of leadership is more of a command and control style, just because that's what is more familiar to boys and men. And so what happens, I think, is that when women get in these roles where they are expected to make the tough decisions, to be more assertive, what we would call, all of a sudden, even though there's a fact that you expect these decisions to be made, you don't necessarily expect to see that coming from women. On the one hand, I've been told some of the reasons I got my promotions was because I was willing to make those tough decisions, but I ran the risk of when I made those tough decisions, I became the witch with a B, right?
Yeah.
So some of it is stereotypical, and yet at the same time, if you can get the sponsorship, if you can get males advocating for you, all of a sudden, some of those decisions that you make that might be perceived as more traditional in the command and control world are supported, embraced, and celebrated, and rewarded. So I think it's this whole ecosystem that we've talked about needing all of those pieces to neutralize that. That may be part of the reason that Hillary Clinton doesn't fall into the witch category anymore, is because she's not necessarily in that same role anymore.
Well, I also think that Hillary Clinton's not in that role anymore because she changed how she reacted as well.
True.
So one of the things that I learned, and I got that same advice early on, you know, Pat, they think that you're a bossy broad. And that came from my mentor, who was in his mid-60s and a real senior white executive, you know, white bread as you come. But he said, they think you're a bossy broad. And I said, well, what do I have to do about that? He said, absolutely nothing. So I said, he goes, that's their problem, not yours. What I have experienced, and I have a few more women to watch. Now I'm very lucky to be in an organization led by the top female CEO in the world, and she's doing a fabulous job changing that stereotype, because you can make the tough decisions, you can make the hard choices, and not be the witch with any other letter before the itch, right? It's possible. However, I think we've watched, and it goes to my earlier comment from before about some of us feeling that that C-suite is distasteful, because we've watched other women have to be, think that they have to behave that way to be heard. And getting frustrated, and then exhibiting some of those same witchy behaviors that would only be viewed as firm and assertive by the men. It's distasteful in the men too, let's face it. But for some reason, you don't expect it to come out of our bodies. We don't have to let it come out of our bodies. And I think we need to really help women see that you can be Ginny Rometty. You can be firm, make the tough choices, but still be a human being that relates on a human being level. And I think that that's just, you know, there are not just stereotypes, real good examples in my life of women who behave badly, and that I would ask to actually help us turn the tide, so that's not what we're experiencing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. One final question. We're out of time. So one final question. Yes.
Hi, I'm Christy Williams with CBIZ Valuation Group. This is great, by the way. I'm thinking, do you find that with so few women in leadership roles, do you find that they can be intimidated by aspiring women? And if so, who do we report them to? No, but really, Marilyn and Pat touched on it a little bit, but being mentored by men, because so many women can be intimidated by aspiring leaders like ourselves in this room.
Madeleine Albright says that if there is there's a sure place in hell for women who don't help women, but a special place in hell, special place in hell. I think that there's perhaps a level of insecurity where, you know, women say, I'm not going to get to that role, but I see that less and less in the workforce, because there are so many good women who really want to invest and help others be successful. But I'm sure you found it, it's horrible, so go find somebody else, right? Go find somebody else, because you're never going to change how they behave. But it exists, and it exists with men who don't want to help younger men. I mean, that does exist, and we just need to find the right role models and the right mentors.
Absolutely. All right, well, I want to thank you so much. It has been inspiring, educational, entertaining. And thank you all for joining us this morning for this conversation. Our panelists will be lingering at the front for a few minutes, so if you have any final comments or questions that you want to ask them on the way out, please do so. And I hope to see you all again soon. at a similar panel. So thank you so much. Thank you.